The knock came at midnight exactly. Not a hesitant knock. Not the knock of someone who has been standing outside, working up the courage. 3 deliberate, evenly spaced knocks that said, "I know you're awake, and I know you've been expecting this, and I am sorry it took this long, but here I am." Zale was on his feet before the 3rd knock finished. Not startled, not surprised, moving with that particular quality he had that I was only now understanding was not calmness at all but readiness. The difference between a person who is relaxed and a person who is always, in every quiet moment, prepared for the quiet to end. He looked at me. I said, "It's my father." He said, "I know." We looked at each other for half a second across the kitchen table where we had been sitting for the last 3 hours, the remnants of the conversation between us, the coffee that had gone cold. The piece of paper where Zale had written 3 names and I had written 2, and we had both stared at the overlap in the middle. 3 hours of him telling me things in that low, stripped-back voice, the one without the careful nothing in it, and me listening the way I had learned to listen from a man who never wasted words, completely and without interruption. 3 hours of the shape of my life rearranging itself. And now my father was at the door in the rain at midnight, and we were out of time. I went to the door. He was standing on the step with a canvas bag over one shoulder and his old wax jacket that he had owned since before I was born, and his face, which was the face I had looked at my entire life and read as ordinary, as safe, as entirely legible, and which I was reading now like a document in a language I had just been taught to translate. He was frightened. He was hiding it well, the way someone hides it well when they have had practice, when fear is not a new visitor, but an old one they have learned to manage. But it was there in the set of his jaw and the stillness around his eyes, and the way he was standing just slightly more upright than usual, braced. The posture of a man who has spent 20 years hoping something wouldn't arrive and is now standing in its arrival and refusing to fold. He looked at me. He said, "You look like your mother when you're angry." I said, "I'm not angry." He said, "You look like her anyway." I stepped back and let him in. He came into the hallway and stopped when he saw Zale. The 2 of them looked at each other, and there was a whole conversation in that look, long and complicated and completely without words. The kind of exchange that only happens between people who know exactly what the other one is, and have each been pretending not to for a significant period of time. My father said, "You're younger than I expected." Zale said, "You're exactly what I expected." My father looked at him for another moment, and then something in his face released, very slightly, the way a fist opens when the thing it was holding is finally put down, and he said, "She knows." Zale said, "She knew before I did." My father looked at me. Something moved across his face. Not quite pride, not quite sorrow, the complicated overlap of both that parents get when their children turn out to be more than they raised them to be, and the realization comes at the worst possible time. He said, "I'm sorry, Saren." I said, "Sit down, Dad. Tell me about the thing you took." He sat down. And that is where part 2 actually begins. If you have been waiting for this since part 1 ended, then first of all, comment below because I need to know how many of you are here, and second of all, subscribe right now because this is the part of the story where everything that was buried comes up. And once it comes up, there is no putting it back down, and you are absolutely not going to want to miss a single word of what my father said sitting at my kitchen table at midnight with his wax jacket still on and his hands flat on the surface in front of him like a man about to give a confession he has been rehearsing for 20 years. His name, his real name, the one he stopped using before I was born, was not Oren. It was Cass Farrell. And before he was the man who called me every Sunday and grew tomatoes and had opinions about drainage, he was, for 11 years, one of the most effective intelligence handlers in an organization with no official name, no government affiliation, and no accountability to anything except its own internal logic and the interests of the people who funded it. He said, "I was good at it. I want you to know that because I need you to understand that I didn't do it reluctantly or accidentally. I was good at it, and I chose it, and I believed for a long time that what I was doing mattered." I said, "What changed?" He said, "You." He looked at his hands. He said, "Your mother was already gone. And you were 8 years old and you drew a picture of me in your school art class. Just a man standing in a doorway. And your teacher wrote at the bottom, 'Saren says this is her dad coming home.' And when I looked at that picture, I thought about what I actually did when I was away. What I actually coordinated. What those trips were really for. And I looked at this picture a child drew of a man in a doorway just coming home, and I thought, I cannot be both things. I cannot be what I am and also be the person she drew. The kitchen was very quiet. He said, "It took me 3 more years to get out. You don't leave quickly. You leave carefully. You negotiate. You trade. The thing they want most from an outgoing handler is confidence. Confidence that you won't talk. That you won't act against them. That the information you carry dies with you or at least stays dormant indefinitely." Zale said, "And what did you give them?" My father looked at him. He said, "I gave them 7 years of compliance. 7 years of nothing. Not a word. Not a contact. Not a whisper. I moved. Changed the name back to Voss, which was always my mother's name anyway. Got the qualification in civil engineering I'd always deferred. Raised Saren. Grew things. Called my daughter every Sunday." He paused. "And I kept the archive. There it was." I said, "What archive?" He said, 11 years of operational records. Names. Assignments. Outcomes. Financial flows. Every contract I coordinated. Every person I ever managed. Every name above me that signed off on things I coordinated. The full picture. Not notes, not summaries. Original documents. Encrypted. Backed up across 3 locations. Zale was very still. He said, "They know you have it." My father said, "They've always known." That was the point. The archive was the reason they let me leave. Not my 7 years of silence. The silence was a courtesy. The archive was the actual insurance. As long as it exists and as long as I'm the only one who can access it, I'm more useful alive and quiet than dead and documented. I said, "But something changed." He said, "The man who brokered my exit died. And Selmar. He was old and it was natural and it still ruined everything. He was the one who held the understanding. The one on their side who remembered why the arrangement existed and what it protected. When he died, institutional memory went with him. And the people who came up behind him looked at the file and saw not an arrangement, but an unresolved liability." He looked at me. He said, "They sent someone to assess the situation about 2 years ago. I didn't know until later who they sent." Zale said nothing. I looked at my husband. He said, quietly, to the table, "It was me." My father said, "I know. I made you the moment you started dating my daughter. I didn't know the organization. I didn't have that context yet, but I knew the training. You can always see it if you know what to look for. The way a person positions themselves in a room. The way they listen. The way they are never, not once, caught off guard." He looked at Zale. He said, "I watched you with her. For months I watched. And I made a decision not to say anything because whatever you had come to do, you weren't doing it. You were just being with her. And I thought, either I am catastrophically wrong about what you are, or you made a choice. And the way you looked at my daughter told me which one it was." The room was very quiet. Bruschetta had come downstairs at some point and was sitting on top of my father's canvas bag in the hallway with an expression that suggested she had known all of this for years and was relieved someone was finally saying it out loud. I said, "So what happens now? What do they want that the archive didn't already cover?" My father reached into the inside pocket of his wax jacket. He put a small USB drive on the table. Gunmetal gray. No markings. He said, "The archive contains everything from my 11 years. Contracts, names, financial records. But there is one section of it that is more dangerous than everything else combined. One case. An operation that ran for 3 years in the early part of my career. I was a junior handler. I didn't fully understand what I was coordinating until it was over. When I understood, I documented everything I could find about it, and I encrypted it separately, within the archive, but behind a second level of access that even I can't break without this." He looked at the drive. He said, "This operation involved people who are no longer in the organization. People who left and built other lives. Public lives. Significant ones. 3 of them currently hold positions, elected or appointed, that would make the contents of that file a matter of serious public consequence. The organization doesn't want the file destroyed. If the file is destroyed, it cannot be used for leverage. They want the file. They want to own it. That's all leverage is, ownership of a truth someone else would rather keep buried. I said, and if they get it. He said, then 3 people in significant public positions remain owned. And the organization that owns them continues to function without consequence indefinitely. Zale said, and if they don't get it. My father said, then someone releases it. And everything changes. Or someone destroys it and the leverage disappears, and the 3 people go free and the organization loses a significant part of its control infrastructure. He looked at both of us. He said, I've been deciding for 20 years what to do with it. Release it and it becomes a spectacle. Lives are destroyed, some of which deserve it and some of which don't, because there are families and there are people around them who knew nothing. Destroy it and I lose the only thing keeping me alive. Keep it and I am permanently a liability to an organization that is running out of patience. He pushed the drive to the center of the table. He said, I think it's time to stop carrying it alone. I am going to need you to comment right now because this is the part of the story where I stopped being a middle school art teacher who had accidentally discovered her husband's second phone and became something I do not have a clean word for yet. And I need to know you're with me. Like this video. Subscribe if you are new. Tell me in the comments what you think is on that drive because some of you are going to be right and you deserve to know it. We sat at that table until 2 in the morning. Zale had a whiteboard in his office that he used for what he had always told me was project planning, and which I now understood was actual operational planning. And he brought it downstairs and set it up in the kitchen, and the 3 of us mapped everything we knew onto it with markers and lines, and the specific controlled energy of people who are frightened and refusing to let the fear run faster than the thinking. Zale knew the organization's operational patterns. He knew the people who would be assigned, the timelines they worked to, the pressure points they responded to, and the ones they didn't. He spoke about it in a flat, factual voice without apology or embellishment, and I watched my father listen to him with the careful attention of a man recognizing a peer and making his peace with what that meant for his daughter. My father knew the archive. He knew what was in it and what each element was worth to whom and where the bodies, metaphorical and otherwise, were buried. He spoke about it with the precision of someone who has organized a large and dangerous library in his head for 2 decades and knows exactly where every book is. And I, Saren Voss, art teacher, owner of one cat named Bruschetta, who is now asleep on my father's canvas bag and refusing to move. I looked at the whiteboard. I said, we're approaching this wrong. Both of them looked at me. I said, you're both thinking about this as a security problem. How to protect the drive, how to manage the threat, how to stay ahead of whoever they send next. But it's not a security problem. It's a leverage problem. And you don't solve a leverage problem by hiding. You solve it by changing who holds the leverage. Zale said, what are you thinking? I said, they want the drive because it gives them control over 3 people. Right now your father holds the drive, which means your father is the liability. But what if the drive wasn't held by a person at all? What if its contents were held by a structure? Something that releases automatically under specific conditions. Something that cannot be bargained with or threatened because there is no single person to bargain with or threaten. My father looked at me. He said slowly, a dead man's switch. I said, a very well-designed one. With multiple release conditions and multiple custodians, none of whom have the full picture. And then you tell them it exists. Transparently. You don't hide it. You hand them the information that the drive is no longer the point because the information is already distributed in a way they cannot contain. Zale said, it removes the leverage on your father. If he's no longer the sole custodian, there's no reason to come for him. I said, it also removes their leverage on the 3 people in the file. Because if the organization can't control the release, they can't use it as a threat anymore. It either releases or it doesn't, but it cannot be owned. My father was quiet for a long moment. He said, you worked that out just now. I said, I've been working it out since I left the coffee shop this afternoon. I just needed the full picture before I said it. He looked at me the way he had looked at the drawing I made in art class when I was 8 years old, and I understood now what that look had cost him then, and what it meant for him to be looking at me like that now, 26 years later. In my kitchen at 2 in the morning with a USB drive on the table and a son-in-law who is a retired hitman. He said, "Your mother would have done exactly the same thing." I said, "You can tell me about her later. Right now I need to know who Zale trusts." Zale looked at me. I said, "Not from the organization. Outside it. Someone with enough reach to help us build this and enough independence to hold a piece of it without being pressured." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Vale." I said, "I thought she worked with you." He said, "She did. She left 8 months ago. Same reason I was close to leaving. She has been building something outside. I don't know exactly what. But she contacted you, which means she's moving and she's chosen a side." I said, "Call her." He said, "It's 2 in the morning." I said, "Zale." He picked up his phone. I want to pause here and tell you that there is a version of this story where this is the part 1 fall apart. Where the accumulated weight of the previous 24 hours, the phone behind the headboard, the photograph of myself taken before we met, the coffee shop, my father on the doorstep in the rain. All of it lands on me at once, and I have to be held together by other people. That version of me exists. I know she does. She was sitting very close to the surface in the kitchen when Zale pressed his forehead to the back of my head, and I had to breathe through my nose to keep my face together. She was right there when my father said, "You look like your mother." But she was not the version of me that this moment needed. And I had decided at 2 in the morning with a canvas bag under a cat and a whiteboard covered in lines that I was going to be the version of me this moment needed and deal with the other one later. Vale Sorn answered on the second ring. Zale put her on speaker. He said, "You contacted my wife. She said she needed the information." He said, "That was my decision to make." She said, "You weren't making it fast enough." A pause. He said, "We have the drive. Oren is here. Saren has an approach. I need to know what you've built." A longer pause. She said, "How much does Saren know?" I said, "Everything. Start talking." Another pause. Shorter this time. She said, "I have 4 custodians already positioned. People outside the organization, outside government, with enough credibility to hold pieces of a distributed disclosure and enough motivation to do it correctly. I have been building this for 8 months. I was waiting for the drive." I said, "How did you know the drive existed?" She said, "Zale told me. 3 years ago. Before he fully understood what he'd walked into. He told me there was an archive and a handler who'd retired with insurance, and he told me because he trusted me, and I filed it away because I trust him back." I said, "So you've been building a structure for 8 months waiting for us to end up exactly here." She said, "I've been building a structure for 8 months hoping you wouldn't need it." "But yes." I said, "We need it." She said, "I know. That's why I called your wife." Zale looked at me across the whiteboard. I looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had spent 3 years keeping a secret to protect someone who had spent 4 weeks dismantling the secret and 3 hours rebuilding it into something functional, and who was only now fully appreciating the particular irony of that. I said to him, quietly, "You should have told me." He said, "I know." I said, "Not because I couldn't handle it." He said, "I know that too. I think I was afraid that if you knew what I was you would stop seeing what I actually am." I said, "And what are you actually?" He said, without hesitation, without the careful nothing, without any of the architecture he had built around himself. "Someone who gave everything up on the 4th date because you were wearing my coat, and I thought I have never in my life wanted to be a person who does what I do, and I want to be different for her." The kitchen was very quiet. My father was looking at the table with the expression of a man who deeply respects the moment happening in front of him and is also acutely aware he is sitting 3 feet away from it. Bruschetta opened one eye from the canvas bag. I said to Zale, "We'll talk about this properly when this is over." He said, "Yes." I said, "All of it." He said, "All of it." I said, "Good." And then I said, louder, for Vale on the phone, "What do we need to do first?" She said, "The drive needs to be copied. Not once. Multiple times. Each copy holds a fragment. I'll send you an encryption protocol. Your father will need to walk us through the second access layer. And we need to be finished before morning, because if my timeline is right they will have someone positioned in your area by dawn." My father picked up the drive from the middle of the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it in his palm and held it out toward Zale. Zale looked at it. He looked at my father. My father said, I watched you with my daughter for 3 years. I watched you look at her. I watched you come home. I watched you decide, every single day, that she was worth more than whatever they were paying you to be. And I kept my silence because the debt I owe for not telling her the truth before you did is a debt I'll be paying for a long time. But I know what careful looks like. And I know what choosing looks like. He said, I trust you with this. Zale took the drive. He held it for a moment, and then he set it on the table in front of me. He said, she holds it. My father looked at him. He said, it was always about her. It should be in her hands. I looked at the drive on the table in front of me. I picked it up. It was lighter than the weight of everything it contained had any right to be. Small and cold and gunmetal gray and holding 20 years of other people's decisions that had all, somehow, led to my kitchen table at 2 in the morning. I put it in my pocket. I said, all right. Let's start. Leave a comment right now telling me what you felt when Zale said she holds it, because I need to know, and then keep reading because the next part of this night is where the comedy that I promised you at the very beginning of this story makes its full return. And I need you to be ready for it because it arrives in the form of bruschetta and an extremely unfortunate series of events involving my father, a motion sensor light, and the man they sent to the house at 4 in the morning who was absolutely not prepared for any of it. We worked through the night. My father walked Vale through the second encryption layer over the phone while Zale copied the drive onto 4 separate devices, each receiving only a fragment of the total, each fragment meaningless without the others. Vale had prepared the protocol exactly as she said she had, 8 months of preparation clicking into place with the quiet satisfaction of a plan meeting the moment it was built for. I made coffee. Correctly this time. Multiple times. I also made toast because I am an art teacher and I process stress through providing food and also because it was 3 in the morning and everyone in my kitchen was running on adrenaline and it occurred to me that you cannot dismantle a 20-year intelligence conspiracy on an empty stomach. My father ate 3 pieces of toast without commenting on them and I chose to interpret that as high praise. At some point during the second hour my father looked up from the laptop he was working on and said, to no one in particular, she always did pay attention. Even as a child. You couldn't have a private conversation within 40 feet of her. I once tried to organize a surprise birthday party, and she had the full guest list and the cake flavor within 6 hours. I said, the phone call with Aunt Dree. You did it in the kitchen. He said, you were 8. I said, the kitchen has good acoustics. Zale made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family as one. My father looked at him. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a kind of understanding between 2 careful people who had both, it turned out, been consistently underestimated by everyone except the woman they were both trying to protect. Bruschetta had migrated from the canvas bag to the top of the whiteboard at some point, which physically should not have been possible, but Bruschetta has always treated structural limitations as suggestions. She sat up there looking down at the operation with the energy of a general reviewing a campaign map, occasionally reaching down to touch a marker with one paw, which was not helpful but was very on brand. It was at 4:13 in the morning. I know this because I had just looked at the clock and calculated that I had been awake for 22 hours, that Zale went still. He was standing near the window. He had been moving around the kitchen all night, and at some point he had positioned himself near the window without making it obvious, which I understood now was not a coincidence. He said, quietly, without looking away from the window, we have company. My father's hands stopped moving on the laptop. I said, where? He said, across the street. Blue car. He's been there 40 minutes. I said, one person. He said, that I can confirm. There may be more I can't. My father said, they moved faster than we expected. Zale said, they usually do. There was a silence while we recalibrated. Then my father looked at me and said, very carefully, Saren. I need you and the drive to go upstairs. Right now. 2nd floor, away from the front of the house. I said no. He said, Saren. I said, Dad. I have spent 4 weeks quietly investigating my own husband while making packed lunches and teaching 6th graders the difference between watercolor and gouache. I have had exactly one night to process the complete dismantling of everything I thought I knew about my life. I am not going upstairs. My father looked at Zale. Zale looked at me. He said, she's not going upstairs. My father said, you're both impossible. Zale said, we have options. One person in a car 40 minutes before dawn is not a strike team. It's a watcher. Someone sent to confirm location. If we move now, we control the next stage. If we wait, they control it. My father said, move where? Zale said, they won't expect us to come out. He looked at me. He said, there's a back way. I said, through the garden. He said, yes. I said, it's November. He said, I know. I looked at my father. My father looked at his canvas bag, which bruschetta was now on again, and which contained, among a few days of clothing, the original encrypted drive housing that he had carried from the house. I said, Dad, take the bag. Bruschetta, off. Bruschetta looked at me. I said, I'm serious. She stepped off the bag with the precise dignity of someone who has decided to comply, but wants it noted that she is doing so voluntarily. And this is where I need to tell you about the motion sensor light. Our back garden has a motion sensor security light that Zale installed 18 months ago, which I had understood at the time as a reasonable home security measure, and which I now understood was installed by a man whose professional background made reasonable home security feel inadequate. The light is, and I say this with love, extremely sensitive. It has gone off for foxes, for next door's cat, for large moths, for me walking to the recycling bin in the dark, and once, memorably, for what appeared to be a significant gust of wind. We went out the back door in single file. Zale first. Then me. Then my father, who is 63 and was wearing his wax jacket and carrying a canvas bag and moving with a speed and quietness that reminded me, jarring and sudden, that he had not always been the man with the tomato garden. We got approximately 4 feet into the garden before the light came on like a small sun. All three of us froze. In the silence that followed, from somewhere behind the back fence, a fox screamed. If you have never heard a fox scream at 4 in the morning, you are lucky. If you have never heard a fox scream at 4 in the morning while frozen in a lit-up garden during an active intelligence situation, you have truly not lived. My father said, in a whisper that was somehow also extremely expressive, "What is that?" I said, "Fox." He said, "Why is it doing that?" I said, "It does that." Zale had not moved. He was scanning the back fence line with the methodical patience of someone who finds fox screaming unremarkable and was waiting for anything that was actually relevant. The light went off. We moved. Across the garden, through the gate at the back, into the narrow service lane behind the row of houses. The fox screamed again from somewhere to the left. My father made a very small sound that I believe was involuntary. Zale put his hand briefly on my back as we moved into the lane, and I felt it through my coat, and I thought, in the middle of all of this, in the absurd cold dark of a November service lane at 4 in the morning while a fox screamed at us, and my father tried not to react to it, I thought about the 4th date and the coat, and I thought about how strange love is, that it chooses the most inconvenient possible moments to feel most like itself. We came out 2 streets over. Zale had a car there. Not his usual car. A different one, plain and unremarkable, parked half on the curb in a way that suggested it had been there long enough to look like it belonged. He had the keys. Of course he had the keys. I decided not to ask when he had arranged this and simply got in. My father got in the back. He put the canvas bag on his lap. He looked out the window at the street. He said, quietly, "I'm sorry for all of this. I want you to know that every choice I made that led us here, I made thinking I was keeping you out of it." I turned around to look at him. He said, "I should have known that keeping you out of it and keeping you safe are not the same thing." I said, "No, they're not." He said, "You're going to have questions. About your mother. About those years. I'll answer all of them." I said, "I know." He said, "Not tonight." I said, "Not tonight." He nodded. He looked out the window again. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, so quietly I almost didn't catch it, "She'd be very proud of you. Tonight. The whiteboard thing. The switch." She thought that way. She always found the third option when everyone else was only seeing 2. I faced forward. The city was dark and quiet outside the windows. Zale was driving in the unhurried, deliberate way he drove everything, no urgency in the movement, but nothing wasted either. I said, "Where are we going?" He said, "Vale has a place. 15 minutes. She'll be there." I said, "And then?" He said, "We finish what we started at the kitchen table. And then we make contact." I said, "With the organization?" He said, "Yes." I said, "You're going to do it?" He said, "We are." I looked at him. He said, "You said no secrets. This one is yours as much as mine." I said, "Zale." He said, "Saren." I said, "When this is done." He said, "I know." I said, "All of it. The beginning. The assignment. The fourth date. All of it properly." He said, "All of it. Properly. I'll tell you everything." He said it the way he said most things that mattered. Quietly. Without decoration. The way you say something when you mean it completely and do not need volume to prove it. I looked at the drive in my hand. Small. Cold. Gunmetal gray. 20 years and 3 names, and a decision my father made when I was 8 years old looking at a drawing of a man in a doorway. Subscribe right now if you haven't, because the next part is where we meet the people on the other end of this and where Zale walks back into the world he left and does the most dangerous thing he has ever done, and it is not what you think it is. Comment below and tell me, do you think the organization takes the deal? Do you think there's a deal to be made? Because one of you is going to be right and I want you to know it. Vale's place was a flat above a dry cleaning business, which felt both deeply mundane and exactly right. She opened the door before we knocked, which meant she had cameras, which meant she had prepared this place the way Zale prepared things, thoroughly and quietly and well in advance. She looked at my father. She said, "Casperel." He said, "Nobody has called me that in 20 years. She said, "Good. Then it still has the right weight." She let us in. The flat was small and functional and contained, I noticed, exactly what it needed and nothing sentimental. A table. Chairs. Equipment that I could not have named 6 weeks ago and could now identify in general terms. A window overlooking the empty street with good sight lines in both directions. The place of someone who lived carefully. She looked at me and said, "You have the drive." I said, "I have it." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Ask me that in a week." She almost smiled. We sat down and we finished what we had started at the kitchen table. The last fragment was copied. The custodians were contacted for people in different locations who each received their fragment through a protocol Vale had built, none of them knowing who the others were. The dead man's switch was constructed, the release conditions defined, the triggers set. It was methodical and quiet, and in another context it would have been entirely unremarkable, just 4 people around a table completing a task. What it actually was the end of something. 20 years of a single man carrying an impossible weight alone in a house with a vegetable garden and a very old Labrador, calling his daughter every Sunday and hoping the past stayed buried long enough. My father sat back when it was done. He looked older in that moment than he had all night, not more frightened, just more tired, the specific exhaustion of a burden set down rather than shifted. He said, to the room, to nobody in particular, "What happens now?" Zale said, "Now we tell them." He looked at me. I nodded. He picked up the phone. Not the second phone, not the one from behind the headboard. A third phone, which Vale handed him, a clean one, and he dialed a number from memory that he said out loud while he dialed it, for Vale to write down, and that simple act of saying the number aloud in front of us felt like its own kind of declaration. No more private phones. No more architecture. Everything visible. It rang twice. A voice answered. Male, flat, not unfriendly, the specific neutrality of a professional. Zale said, "This is Ghost. Put me through to whoever is currently holding my file." A pause. The voice said, "Ghost has been inactive." Zale said, "Ghost is calling in. Put me through." A longer pause. Then a different voice. Older. Also flat, but underneath the flatness something else, a texture, the weight of someone who has been waiting for this call and is now deciding how to approach it. Zale said, "I'm going to tell you something and I need you to listen to it completely before you say anything." He did. He told them about the switch. Not about the drive, not about its contents, Not about my father. Just the switch. The fact of its existence, the conditions of its release, the distribution of its fragments, the impossibility of containing it by conventional means. He spoke for 4 minutes. He was precise and complete and utterly without apology. When he finished, there was a silence. The voice said, "You understand what you're doing?" Zale said, "Yes." The voice said, "You understand what this costs you?" Zale said, "Yes." The voice said, "Why?" Zale said, "Because I canceled an assignment on the 4th date, and I'd do it again. And because the man you sent me to get to is sitting across from me right now, and he's been carrying this for 20 years, and he deserves to put it down." Another silence. Longer this time. The voice said, "What do you want?" Zale said, "The arrangement your predecessor had with Cass Farrell, reinstated and expanded. His safety is permanent and non-negotiable. His daughter's safety is the same. The file stays in the switch. It never releases. Everyone goes home." The voice said, "And you?" Zale said, "I'm already home." He looked at me when he said it. I looked back at him. The voice said, "We'll need time." Zale said, "You have 12 hours. After that, the switch begins a passive countdown." He hung up. The room was quiet. My father let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 20 years. Vale was looking at her hands. I said to Zale, "I'm already home." He said, "Yes." I said, "Was that for them or for me?" He said, "Both." I said, "You're very sure of yourself for someone who taped a phone to our headboard." He said, "I have never been sure of anything in my life. Except you." My father made a sound that I believe was involuntary and covered it with a cough that convinced nobody. Vale stood up and went to make tea because she was, underneath the precision and the flat effect and the carefully controlled face, apparently a person who responded to emotional moments by making hot beverages, which I respected deeply. I stood up. I went to the window and I looked out at the empty street below and I thought about all of it in order: the granola bar in the pharmacy, the vitamin display, the way 2 millimeters of facial movement had landed in my knees, the heating timer, the green mug, the Sunday sourdough, the photograph behind the headboard, the phone with the word Target, the stand down at 2 in the morning, the coffee shop, my father on the doorstep in the rain, the drive in my pocket. I thought about Cleo. I turned around. I said, "The person who ordered Cleo. Is it in the archive?" Silence. My father said, very carefully, "It is." I said, "Is it one of the 3? He said, "No. It was an internal order. Someone within the organization who believed she was a threat." I said, "Then the arrangement covers it." He said, "Saren." I said, "If they want the switch dormant, then they deliver the person who ordered Cleo. That is a condition. Non-negotiable." Zale was looking at me. I said, "She was my best friend. She died because she was trying to protect me. I am not letting that disappear into a quiet arrangement." My father looked at Zale. Zale looked at me. He said, "I'll add it to the terms." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I've been looking for them for 14 months. I would have found them eventually." I said, "I know. I want it in the terms." He said, "It's in the terms." Vale came back with tea. She put a mug in front of each of us and sat back down and said, "We wait." We waited. My father fell asleep in his chair at around 6, which I found both impressive and enormously human. Vale monitored the equipment in the way of someone whose nervous system has learned to idle rather than rest. Zale sat across from me and we talked in low voices about things that had nothing to do with any of this. Small things, the hamster naming situation, which he found funnier the more detail I gave him. The time Bruschetta had knocked an entire shelf of books onto a man who had come to fix the boiler and then sat next to him while he recovered, as if she had orchestrated the whole thing for company. At one point I said, quietly, "Tell me something from before. Something real. Not the cover story." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I grew up near water. A river. I used to count the sounds it made when I couldn't sleep. That's where the counting came from. Long before vitamins." I said, "What else?" He said, "I've never told anyone my real first name. Not in 20 years of this." I said, "What is it?" He said, "Zale is real. It's what my mother called me. My file name is different. But Zale is mine." I said, "Good." I wasn't going to learn a new name. He almost smiled. More than 2 millimeters this time. I said, I need you to know something. He said, all right. I said, when I found the phone. And the photograph. And the company that doesn't exist. I was frightened. I want to be honest about that. I was frightened in a way I hadn't been since Cleo died, and I sat with that fear for 4 weeks, and I made a decision that the fear was not going to make my choices for me. He said, I know. I said, but I also need you to know that none of it, not one moment of it, made me stop. Not toward the door. I was never moving toward the door. I was always moving toward the truth because the truth was the only direction that had you in it. He looked at me. He said, Saren. I said, I know you could have been different. I know what you were when we met, and I know what the job was, and I know that on paper this is a story where I should be furious. He said, you have every right to be. I said, I'm not telling you that to absolve you. We're going to have that whole conversation. Properly. With all of it on the table. He said, I know. I said, I'm telling you because I want you to know that when I found the phone, the first thing I felt, underneath the fear, was that whatever this was, whatever you were, it was still you. The heating timer was still real. The green mug was still real. The 4th date was still real. And those things and whatever else you are not mutually exclusive. He was quiet. I said, I used your words. He said, very quietly, I know. They were Cleo's first. The room was very still. He said, I'm sorry about her. I have wanted to tell you that properly for 14 months. Not the version that fits inside a marriage without secrets, but the actual version, which is that she saw me before anyone else did and she tried to protect you from what I might be, and she was right to, and she deserved longer than she got. I said, yes. He said, I'll find who ordered it. I said, I know you will. At 9:17 in the morning the phone rang. Zale answered it. The voice said 4 words. It said, terms are being reviewed. Zale said, you have 3 hours remaining. He hung up. My father was awake. He was sitting up in his chair with the specific alertness of someone whose internal clock has decades of practice. He said, they're going to take it. Zale said, they don't have another option. My father said, they always think they have another option. Zale said, not this time. The switch is clean. The distribution is solid. And they know what's in the file. They cannot afford release. My father nodded slowly. He said to me, you built that. The switch. In the middle of the night at a kitchen table. I said I had help. He said, you had the idea. The rest was execution. I said, Dad. He said, I'm just saying. For someone who teaches 12-year-olds to use paintbrushes. I said, the paintbrush skills were also relevant. He said, how? I said, patience and precision. Same principle. He looked at Zale. He said, she's always been like this. Zale said, I know. I noticed it on the first date. I said, the pharmacy was not a date. He said, it had all the elements. I said, you were counting vitamins. He said, I was. And you told me they didn't work and you were completely right, and I thought, she's going to be a problem. My father made a sound that was, this time unmistakably, a laugh. Brief and low and genuine. The room felt different after that. Not lighter exactly, but less compressed. The way a room feels when the thing everyone has been holding their breath about begins, very slowly, to resolve. The call came at 11:40. They took the terms. All of them. Including Cleo. I am not going to tell you what I felt in that moment, because some things belong to the moment they happened in and to the people who were in the room for them. I will tell you that my father put his hand over mine on the table. I will tell you that Vale turned to the window for a moment. I will tell you that Zale looked at me across the table with the look that started this whole thing, the one that felt like recognition without context, like knowing a word before you've been taught it, and it was still there, entirely intact, undiminished by everything the night had held. We drove home at noon. My father came with us, because where else was he going to go, and because the Labrador named Concrete was being watched by a neighbor who thought my father had gone to visit a cousin, a cover story so mundane it had survived entirely without support. We pulled into our street. The blue car was gone. Zale parked. We got out. We went inside. Bruschetta was sitting in the hallway looking at us with the expression of an animal who had been left home alone during a significant event and had opinions about this. She looked at my father. She looked at his bag. She walked over and sat on his feet. He looked down at her. He said, "Hello." She said nothing. She just sat on his feet and stared at the middle distance with immense dignity. He looked at me. He said, "She does this." I said, "She likes you." He said, "She's sitting on my feet." I said, "That's how she likes people. She did it to Zale on day one. You should feel honored. She once bit a plumber." My father looked down at Bruschetta. He said, very quietly, "All right then." And he stayed exactly where he was. Zale went into the kitchen. I heard the familiar sounds, the low flame, the movement of someone who knows a kitchen the way they know a language, fluent and unhurried. I stood in the hallway and I listened to it, and I thought about every Sunday morning I had stood in this hallway and listened to those same sounds and felt safe in a way I didn't fully understand and understood completely now. I went into the kitchen. Zale looked up. He said, "Sit down." I said, "You don't have to." He said, "It's 11 in the morning and neither of us has slept and I am making you breakfast." I said, "It's not Sunday." He said, "Extenuating circumstances." I sat down. He made the eggs. Slow, patient, the lowest heat, 20 minutes, moving them gently. The sourdough was from yesterday, but he put it in the oven and it came out warm enough. The coffee he made in the little Italian stovetop pot and poured it into the green mug without being asked. He put it all in front of me. He sat down across from me. My father came in from the hallway with Bruschetta still somehow attached to his immediate vicinity and sat at the end of the table with his tea and said nothing, just sat there, in my kitchen, in the light of a November noon, with the particular quality of a man who has put something down that he has been carrying for a very long time and is learning what his hands feel like without it. I looked at the green mug. I looked at the eggs. I looked at Zale. He was already looking at me. I said, "I think we need to talk." He said, "I know." I said, "All of it. Beginning to now. No more architecture." He said, "No more architecture." I said, "And then I think we need to sleep for approximately 100 years." He said, "In that order." I said, "In that order." My father said, from the end of the table, without looking up from his tea, "If it helps, I can take Bruschetta for a walk." I said, "She doesn't walk. She doesn't believe in it." He said, "I'll sit outside with her then." He stood up. He picked up his tea. He looked at both of us with the expression of a man who has done many complicated things in his life and recognizes when he is not the most important person in the room. He went outside. Bruschetta, after a moment of principled hesitation, followed him. And then it was just the two of us. In our kitchen. The green mug, and the eggs, and the little Italian stovetop pot. The whiteboard still in the corner with its lines and names. The November light coming through the window the way it always did, low and amber and unhurried. Zale said, "I was sitting in a briefing room when I first saw your photograph. The one from 8 months before. I was given a file. Standard approach protocol. And I opened the file and there was your photograph and I thought." He stopped. I said, "What?" He said, "I thought, this is not something I can do. Before I knew anything about you. Before I had met you or spoken to you or heard your voice. I looked at a photograph of you eating a granola bar in a pharmacy and I thought, not this one. This one I cannot do." I said, "But you did it anyway." He said, "I needed to know I was wrong about myself. I thought if I met you and found out you were ordinary, then I could do the job and leave." I said, "And?" He said, "You were in the vitamin aisle telling a stranger that vitamins don't work and you were right. And you shook my hand and you made me spell my name. And I thought, I was not wrong about myself. I was wrong about how much worse than I thought it was going to be." I said, "You could have walked away. On the 4th date." He said, "I did walk away." I said, "From the job." He said, "Yes." I said, "But not from me." He said, "No. Not from you. I have tried exactly 0 times to walk away from you. I thought about it once in the first year. When things got complicated, I thought, this is not fair to her. She doesn't know I should go. And then you did the thing where you fall asleep on the sofa with your marking on your lap and Bruschetta on your feet, and I thought, I physically cannot do this. I said, that's your reason. He said, that is my reason. I said, I fall asleep on the sofa with my marking. He said, you looked so completely yourself. Like someone who had no idea there was any other way to be. I had spent 10 years being every version of myself except the real one, and you were just you. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, you're going to have to be very patient with me while I process all of this. He said, I know. I said, and honest. About everything going forward. He said, about everything. I said, even the things that are hard to say. He said, especially those. I said, and I need you to know that I am furious with you. He said, I know. I said, and also that I have never for one single moment since I found that phone considered a version of this where I am not sitting at this table with you. He said nothing. He just looked at me with the full weight of that, the look that started everything, the recognition without context. I said, we're going to be okay. He said, yes. I said, it's going to take time. He said, I have time. I have all the time. I picked up the green mug. The coffee was perfect. It was always perfect. Outside, through the window, I could see my father sitting on the back step in his wax jacket with bruschetta next to him, both of them looking at the garden in the November light with the companionable silence of two creatures who have decided they understand each other. I thought about Cleo. I thought about her saying the two things aren't mutually exclusive. I thought about how right she was and how much I wished she were here to know it. I thought about what it means to love someone the way I loved Zale, which is completely and with full knowledge now of everything that complete means. The cost of it and the weight of it and the 4 dates and the 4th date and the coat and the stand down at 2 in the morning and the bakery bag on the counter because he passed it and thought I might want something sweet. I thought about all of it. I drank my coffee. Zale reached across the table and found my hand in the way he always had, without asking, without announcing it, just present, just there. I let him hold it. And that, for now, was enough. That is the end of part 2. That is the end of the story as it stands today. But I need you to know that it is not the end of everything because Cleo's justice is still coming, and there are things my father has not yet told me about my mother, and there are things Zale has not yet told me about the years between the briefing room and the vitamin display, and there is a whole life on the other side of this night that neither of us has seen yet. If you want to know what happens next, then you know what to do. Subscribe. Comment below. Tell me what part of this story broke you open the most. Tell me what you need to know. Tell me if you want more because I have more. There is so much more, and I will bring every single piece of it if you tell me you are here. Like this. Share it with one person. One person who needs a story worth staying up for. Because that is what this was always meant to be. A story worth staying up for. And we are only just beginning.